It's August 2022. American Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi has just landed in Taiwan. She's the most senior US politician to visit since the 90s. Pelosi meets with Taiwan's then president and calls the island an inspiration to all freedom-loving people.
Our delegation came here to send an unequivocal message. America stands with Taiwan.
Beijing is incandescent. China claims Taiwan as part of its territory, even though the island nation has never been ruled by the Chinese Communist Party and has its own democratically elected government. Pelosi's visit is considered a provocation, and to show its displeasure, Beijing conducts an unprecedented series of live-fire military drills, the biggest ever.
3动2攻2八
The People's Liberation Army sends hundreds of warplanes and battleships right over the boundary between China and Taiwan. It also launches a barrage of missile tests and cyber attacks. Over the coming days, the PLA encircles the island, simulating a sea and air blockade in an extraordinary display of military might. It's a deliberately aggressive move, designed to intimidate. China's point is crystal clear. We can take Taiwan by force, if necessary.
The threat China poses is real, and it could be imminent. We hope not, but it certainly could be.
That's what keeps the United States at bay. We can't protect our bases. We can't protect our satellites. We can't protect, our aircraft carriers.
China is rapidly expanding its nuclear arsenal with more warheads and a larger number of sophisticated delivery systems.
A big, strong, powerful country. We're more powerful than they are. We have much better military equipment than they do.
It's very hard to judge what happens in the decision-making black box of the Central Military Commission when it comes to Taiwan.
The people on both sides of the Taiwan Strait are one family. No one can sever our family bonds, and no one can stop the historical trend of national reunification.
It's a home game for China, and so key question for U.S. commanders, how close can you get?
The Communist Party of China is the most potent and dangerous near-peer adversary this nation has ever confronted.
I'm Venetia Rainey, and this is Battle Lines. In this special three-part series, I'll be doing a deep dive into the strengths and weaknesses of China's armed forces, the People's Liberation Army. How significant is China's military build-up? What do Xi Jinping's ongoing purges mean for the PLA? And how likely is an invasion of Taiwan in the next few years? As the US pivots to the Indo-Pacific and the threat of a truly global war looms, understanding China's armed forces has never been more important.
Now, if you ask me how serious the threat is to Taiwan, I would say it is extremely serious. There's a lot of lessons from the war in Ukraine, but if there's one that we can take away, it's that leaders have, time immemorial, fought for territory. And leaders choose power over prosperity every single time.
Oriana Schuyler Mastro is a fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies at Stanford University. She's also the author of Upstart, How China Became a Great Power.
Taiwan is the most important issue to the Communist Party. The economic growth was there to enable them to achieve issues like unification with Taiwan. The Chinese are willing, and Xi Jinping is willing, to sacrifice a degree of economic growth for the sake of unifying with Taiwan. That seems to be very clear, not only based on the rhetoric, but also on the behavior and the capabilities that they're building.
Oriana says that you only need to look at what the PLA has focused on improving in recent decades to surmise that their main goal must be to be able to take Taiwan one day.
They invested in specific capabilities designed to take Taiwan by force. So the initial stages of the war, for example, would be a joint missile campaign. China invests very heavily in those offensive capabilities. The short-range ballistic missiles that China has, you can tell by the range. What are those for? Those are for Taiwan. Right? There's nothing else that they could really be for. And then when you look at the fact that they invested more in a surface fleet than their submarine fleet, why would you need to do that? Well, if you're taking a bunch of people across the strait, you need surface ships more than you need, undersea capabilities.
Joel Wathno agrees that Taiwan is the military's main mission.
I think that's core to their military strategy, and it's not new. It goes back to 1993. That's really when they started to think, well, what does the PLA of the future need to be able to do? And it's number one, deter Taiwan independence. And so that's a coercive mission. And number two, well, what happens if peaceful reunification were to fail? What could the military do in terms of operations? That's a much more demanding thing that they had to think about.
Joel Wathno is a senior research fellow at the Center for the Study of Chinese Military Affairs at the Institute for National Strategic Studies in Washington. Along with his colleague Philip Saunders, he recently wrote a book called China's Quest for Military Supremacy.
And so, the PLA had to think, starting from the 90s, how can we do this? And so they've had now 30 years to think through what the strategy, what the operations would look like, build the capabilities they would need. And Xi Jinping came in and he said, no kidding, by 2027, you must be able to finish this task. Are they there yet? No, frankly, but that has really been, to me anyway, a central focus for them.
But not everyone agrees. Amanda Hsiao is China Director at Eurasia Group, a US-based political risk consultancy. She points to the huge risks involved for Xi and the Chinese Communist Party.
The decision for Beijing, that calculus for whether to turn to military force to take Taiwan, is fundamentally a political question. There's a lot of uncertainties around how the Taiwanese military would respond. There's a lot of uncertainties around how the US would respond. If there is a direct confrontation with the US, that would, involve the prospect of a very long and drawn-out conflict that costs Beijing both blood and treasure. It would risk Beijing's plans to build up its military and economic strength and international influence, which is really the ultimate national objective, right? To achieve national rejuvenation, to make China stronger, and to return China to its rightful place in the world as a major power. And, such a conflict could also raise questions around the legitimacy of the Communist Party. So it's a very risky endeavor that would remain a last resort measure for the Chinese.
Amanda is not the only one who's skeptical. Timothy Heath is a senior international defence researcher at RAND and former US government analyst focused on China. RAND is an independent think tank that regularly works with the Pentagon, but just to be clear, Timothy's views here are his own, not the government's. He believes the PLA's main focus is to keep the Chinese Communist Party in power, and that a conflict over Taiwan is unlikely because it would imperil that. He makes some really interesting counter-arguments to the generally received wisdom that Beijing is on the warpath. For example, this is how he explains Xi Jinping's apparently bellicose language.
So just to go through a couple examples. There's been press where people point out Xi Jinping said, PLA must be combat ready. Well, where did he say that? He said that in the context of a speech to a military delegation, either at the National People's Congress or at the annual CMC meeting or in an inspection to a military unit. It's a standard line. Every leader of any country will say almost exactly the same thing to their own military. In the same speeches, of course, Xi Jinping also says, your number one job is to be loyal to the PLA and make sure we stay in power. And people don't talk about that, but it's in the exact same speech. Every single one of them, he tells them, your number one job is to make sure I stay in power, the CCP stays in power.
When it comes to their military build-up, he believes it's more defensive than offensive.
On the issue of their carriers and military buildup, they do regard deterrence as an important issue. So having a strong-looking military, it's important to send a signal to other countries that China is to be respected and feared, and if push comes to shove, it has some dangerous capabilities.
China does have some dangerous capabilities. And on the surface, it looks like it would be easy for Beijing to gobble up Taiwan.
Now, it's very clear that if we simply look at the military balance across the Taiwan Strait, there is absolutely no competition between the PLA in terms of military capability and Taiwan's armed forces and defense. They are outnumbered, they are outgunned, and Taiwan is in a defensive posture rather than an offensive one.
But a lot depends on exactly how China would go about it. Allegra Mendelsohn is the Telegraph's Asia correspondent and lives in Taiwan. She reports on this stuff all the time. She explains that there are a few different scenarios, each more aggressive and riskier than the one before.
So the first scenario is what one might call a nibble, and this is where China would stage an attack on one of Taiwan's outlying islands. So there's the Kinmen or Jinmen Islands, which are very close to China, as well as Matsu Islands, and there are also a few others. This isn't the most likely now that China has the capability to launch a full-scale attack directly on Taiwan's main island, because by attacking an outlying island first, they would basically be showing their hand and allowing for Taiwan and partners like the US to basically prepare and retaliate if needed. Another option we could see is a blockade, which is the one that we probably hear discussed the most often. In this scenario, the PLA could effectively cut Taiwan off from the rest of the world and then slowly squeeze the island, either that being the attack in and of itself or kind of ahead of a much bigger attack. This is one sort of muscle that we see the PLA flex somewhat regularly. Over the last 3 years, there have been near daily incursions of PLA aircraft into Taiwan's airspace, and the Chinese military drills that they've been running recently seem to be preparing for this kind of scenario as well. Taiwan as an island imports most of its energy, and experts that I've spoken to have said, if taken all together, all the sources of energy that Taiwan has in the event of a blockade, it really wouldn't survive more than 40 days. And there's a very good chance that a full-blown war with China would last more than 40 days. And then you have the biggest, most catastrophic scenario, which is, an all-out invasion. And this is China deploying basically everything at its disposal. And as one of the biggest militaries in the world, that's quite a lot of manpower and military tech and missiles. So this would most definitely escalate into a full-blown war.
The PLA definitely has some clear advantages over Taiwan's armed forces. Here's Joel Wathnow and Philip Saunders from the Institute for National Strategic Studies.
Well, I think what's particularly impressive right now would be some of their amphibious fighting vehicles, so they can just roll off of ships with troops on them. That's obviously essential for any kind of Taiwan contingency. Also, I would point to their long-range artillery. And so we're not talking about things that will go yards. We're talking about, very advanced artillery, precision artillery that can go hundreds of miles. And so that's part of what they would call the firepower campaign, to envelop Taiwan in a massive bombardment.
They have very effective surface-to-air missiles, so as soon as the Taiwan Air Force takes off from their runways and gets up to a certain altitude, the PLA can shoot at them from surface-to-air missiles based on the mainland. So it's going to be very hard for the Taiwan Air Force to remain in the fight for very long.
But that's not the whole story.
This is not Ukraine where you can just roll across the border. You have to cross 100 nautical miles of water in ships or on airplanes. And what we've seen in Ukraine is that those things can be targeted pretty precisely and with pretty lethal effect. And so the PLA would be wandering into, essentially a no man's land. And so just ferrying the troops across, troops who don't have the real experience to do this kind of thing, I think that gives them a lot of heartburn. They're working on ways to try to do this, but I think they're very far from where they need to be currently.
Yeah, I would add to that, you got to get them there, and then you have to supply them once they are there. And that's a big challenging task, to airlift all the tons of supplies that would be needed once you get a foothold on Taiwan. And that's got to be done by ship, it's got to be done by plane, and in a contested combat environment. That will be a real challenge for the PLA.
That brings us to the next big question. When? You heard Joel mention a year that's been bandied around a lot, 2027. So let's start by interrogating that.
So first, let me say the 2027 year is not a deadline. It's a no earlier than date.
Oriana Skylo Mastro again.
So Xi Jinping has told the Chinese military that he wants them to be ready by 2027. And unless Taiwan declares independence or something pretty extreme, the PLA is not going to move on Taiwan until they're ready. So that's why I think of that as a no earlier than date.
Timothy Heath agrees.
There's quite a lot of misunderstanding of this date that's been in the media of 2027. And it all goes, in my opinion, to the media's misunderstanding of Admiral Davidson's comments a couple years ago when he said Xi Jinping had outlined some military modernization goals for 2027. And those goals seem to be tied to potential readiness for missions, including Taiwan. Now, senior U.S. officials subsequently clarified that there's no evidence that Xi Jinping has set a time or deadline for the PLA to be ready to attack Taiwan. They clarified that these are military modernization goals, but what they feared was maybe these modernization goals could, if they're achieved, could give the Chinese leadership an incentive to think about attacking Taiwan. That's a very complex argument. It was lost in the media. Everybody latched onto this idea that 2027 China's going to attack Taiwan, even though there's no evidence to suggest that.
He points out that the Chinese Communist Party have made these sorts of year-specific goals before.
In the early 2000s, we had a similar report. Hu Jintao told the PLA he wanted some modernization goals to be met by 2020, and they were linked to the capability to carry out a range of missions, including potentially Taiwan. At least that's how we understood it. And many of my peers, including myself, firmly believe that what that suggested was the Chinese were setting a date for the military to be ready. And if they're ready by that date, they'll be ordered to attack Taiwan. Now, it turns out we totally misunderstood that speech. There were modernization goals. The Chinese leaders like to set goals for modernization for the military and for economics and other things, and they like to tie to some anniversary. 2027 is the centenary of the PLA's founding. Frankly, I think what the top leader is looking for is he's thinking about a parade, a massive demonstration of all that's been achieved over that 100-year period.
Okay, so not 2027, but then when? The truth is, we just don't know, as Maya Nowens explains.
It's very hard to judge what happens in the decision-making black box of the Central Military Commission when it comes to Taiwan. But certainly the CCP will be looking at what point Xi Jinping would be willing to take the risk of unifying with Taiwan by force, having judged that either the window of opportunity for anything else, such as peaceful unification, has closed or is closing more rapidly than they had judged, or they feel that they are in a better position to take advantage of a moment in time to force unification.
It will almost certainly happen in some form by 2049, the 100th birthday of the Communist People's Republic of China. Xi has repeatedly said that unification with Taiwan is essential to achieving what he calls the Chinese dream, restoring China's great power status once and for all. Only Xi doesn't call it unification. He calls it reunification. "2049 is a long way away, so what signs will suggest that a conflict is imminent?" Here's Timothy again.
Here's what I look for evidence that Xi Jinping was serious about going to war. He starts doing things like Putin, making rants. Wars are emotional topics. If you're trying to get your people to war, every leader who's moving into belligerence wants to start a war. They get pretty emotional about it because they realize the stakes. They realize what's on the line. They know what their head is on the line if it fails. They know the enormous upheaval that this is going to bring. So they tend to put huge amounts of efforts to mobilize public support, give speeches, demonizing the enemy. Putin is a good example of this. Saddam did this. Even the U.S. President Bush, when he prepared for war against Iraq, he made many speeches and sent diplomats out trying to persuade the world, persuade the American people that war was necessary, it was inevitable, and it had to be done. These are the kinds of remarks that we just don't see coming out of China at all. If they really planned to attack Taiwan and knew there's a good chance the U.S. would get involved, I would expect them to build large numbers of, for example, conventional tip ICBMs to threaten to strike the U.S. if the U.S. struck China's homeland. I would expect a buildup of a large fleet of military amphibious assault ships that could carry huge numbers of troops across the strait. Right now, they just got a tiny number. It's just not enough. I would expect them to rethink a lot of their political arrangements for the military. In the Soviet Union, for example, in World War II, Stalin made a lot of changes in the political controls of the Soviet military to improve battlefield effectiveness. I would expect the Chinese rethink their criteria of politics as a top qualification for promotion and retention, and instead place competence, professional expertise at the top of the list. And then the civilian economy. And I would expect the leadership to try and get the people in the mindset of getting ready for war. Encourage movies, shows, books that describe what war is like and glorify its importance, or make the case to the people that we need to do this.
There is an elephant in the room here, the United States of America.
So the US is in a very unique position when it comes to Taiwan. Many people might not know this, but until the 1970s, the US actually recognized the Kuomintang government in Taiwan, and from this emerged the Taiwan Relations Act, which is what many people point to when they talk about whether the United States would come to Taiwan's defense in the event of an attack by China. The actual legislation says that the US will provide Taiwan with arms, and if there is a threat, the government of the day will take quote-unquote appropriate action. So there's obviously a huge amount of room for various interpretations. Over the years, this has translated into strategic ambiguity, which basically means that the US will not say explicitly whether or not they will support Taiwan. President Joe Biden sort of deviated from this, but for the most part, that's been the position.
Washington has an official policy of strategic ambiguity, but the working assumption is that if China threatened Taiwan, the US would step in. There's a few reasons for that. Here's Allegra Mendelsohn to run us through them.
The first is the economic side. So Taiwan is the world's largest manufacturer of semiconductors and advanced microchips. And these are used in everything from phones to weapons to cars. And obviously the US relies on these exports tremendously as well. The island is also located close to several major shipping routes that, again, the US relies on. The second reason would be geopolitics. So Taiwan is situated in what's known as the first island chain. And this is sort of a chain of islands that stretch from Japan all the way down to the Philippines, very strategically important. The third is the rule of law and almost the principle of it. You know, if China was allowed to take Taiwan, particularly following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, this would very likely spell the end of an already eroded global security framework that was set up post-World War II, and could very well lead to a decline in the US's global standing, as well as trigger future conflicts.
Trump has been clear that he wants to pivot away from Europe to focus on the threat of China. It's a long-standing goal by successive American administrations. So in theory, Taiwan should be safe. But some suggest Beijing may have been cheered on by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. After all, the US has refused to commit to fully defending Kyiv, and now Trump is trying to pull out of the conflict completely. Many in his administration are self-proclaimed isolationists, and they don't want America to keep being the world's police. Timothy argues, however, that Taiwan would be completely different.
First off, Ukraine is not a US ally, and the US had no obligation to help. It's very different than our relationship with Taiwan. The Chinese well understand the US security relationship with Taiwan. Our presidents in the past have, well, in Biden's case, he very clearly stated the U.S. will get involved. And the U.S. has some sort of legislation and some sort of de facto treaty with Taiwan. I have yet to find a Chinese analyst who doubts the U.S. will get involved, completely doubts it. They all acknowledge it's possible. So it's a huge risk. Second, why is it necessary? You know, Taiwan hasn't declared independence, and even if they declared independence, I think the first thing the Chinese would do is pick up the phone and call the U.S. and ask them to help get the situation back in box, like they did in 2000. You know, Taiwan did not declare independence, but they had a pro-independence president elected in office. The Chinese were panicked, and they called the U.S. and wanted to manage the situation. So in most cases, I think the Chinese hope that they can manage a Taiwan crisis with the U.S.
If the US did become militarily involved in a fight against China, most assume it would win. So how true is that? Some experts are bullish. Here's Joel Wuthnow again.
Well, it wouldn't be a fair struggle, I think, for the PLA. I think, frankly, the U.S. has been evolving. We have been updating our own capabilities and our operational concepts. So the PLA, I think, they do have some advantages. They are pretty good on cyber, for example, counter space. Some of their long-range missiles are pretty good. But I think we are adapting. We are becoming much more diversified. Our footprint is lighter, and we ourselves are rolling out new capabilities, including things like hypersonic missiles or, for example, the B-21 long-range bomber. We have very significant undersea warfare advantages, and the PLA knows some of it and they don't know some of it. And so it would be a massive gamble, I think, to try to take on the military machinery of the United States.
Amanda Hsiao broadly agrees, but with a caveat.
We know that while the PLA has the world's largest army and navy in terms of number of ships, the US military really remains the world's strongest and most superior fighting force. But the key here is that because of advancements in the PLA, the military balance of power in Beijing's backyard is shifting in China's favor. And so China's modernization efforts has really begun to erode American advantages to the point where the Chinese military can now have the capacity to frustrate a US intervention in the case of a conflict over Taiwan. Chinese missiles can now hit US targets on land, at sea, in the air, across the region, giving China the ability to shut down US bases in the region and in Japan, in Guam, at least temporarily, and also to keep US aircraft carriers and other large ships at bay.
But it's not just each country's military capabilities that would determine the outcome of such a war.
The main problem the United States faces is that China is going to be picking the time and place and fighting wars of a nature that are the most favorable to China.
Oriana Schuyler Mastro.
So even if a war over Taiwan, for example, 95% of different contingencies the United States would win, China is going to pick that 5%.
The geography of a potential conflict over Taiwan is something that all experts say would be a major obstacle for the US. As Philip Saunders explains, no matter which way you cut it,
it's a home game for China, and operating from their own air bases on the mainland close to Taiwan's a pretty big advantage. The U.S. operates more advanced planes, longer ranges, but kind of the weakness for the U.S. Air Force planes is they've got to fly from somewhere. And right now, that's sort of bases in Guam, bases in Japan, maybe bases in the Philippines, but they have to have fixed air bases to fly from and return to. The Air Force is experimenting with lots of ways to diversify those bases. With the Navy, that's typically been carrier-based aviation. And the challenge is that China's developed a number of ways to attack U.S. carriers. And so a key question for U.S. commanders, how close can you get? The closer you can get, the more power you can project and sustain, but the more risk the carrier is in. And if you back further off to provide more protection to the carrier, now all of a sudden all the aircraft have to refuel to get to their targets or to maintain time in the battle area.
Then, of course, there's the non-conventional aspect of a war between the US and China, although it's very uncertain how exactly that would play out. Take, for example, China's fast-expanding nuclear weapons arsenal, which we covered in episode 1. That could be used to prevent any sort of US intervention over Taiwan.
That hasn't historically been a big part of their thinking because they have a policy of no first use of nuclear weapons. But it's been something the United States worries about. If we have a conflict with China, it might start out conventional, but it could escalate into a nuclear war. Now it could escalate into a really big nuclear war. And so is that the goal of this nuclear expansion, to really raise the costs and risks and try to deter U.S. intervention in a Taiwan conflict or other cases?
There's also the role that space assets would play. Again, very uncertain. Amanda Hsiao.
So China now has anti-satellite weapons that can be used to disrupt space-based U.S. command and control systems and communications networks, meaning that should a war break out and China attacks U.S. command and control systems that are sitting in space, that means that individual U.S. units might lose access to communication networks that link back to headquarters and will therefore have to fight alone in isolation without the sort of communications and surveillance and intel support.
So this space war aspect, I think, is an important part of U.S.-China competition, would matter a lot in U.S.-China conflict.
Philip Saunders.
But it's a little hard to predict because, is it an all-out space war where satellites are getting blown up? And the problem with that is it not only blows up your adversary's satellite, it can affect your own satellites in that same low Earth orbit. So you're damaging the enemy capabilities, but you're also damaging your own.
All of this aside, even if it is militarily possible to fight off the US, it clearly carries enormous risks for the Chinese Communist Party, politically, economically, and socially.
It would be a catastrophe. My reading of their foreign policy writings and strategy writings is, one, they don't think it's necessary, and two, they think it'd be catastrophic. War with the U.S. could literally turn nuclear and result in nuclear annihilation of both countries. There's no evidence, in my view, that the Chinese military is gunning for a fight with the U.S. In fact, I read their nuclear buildup as a pretty strong sign that they hope not to get into a conventional fight with the U.S. and they hope to use their nuclear weapons to deter the U.S.
Timothy Heath again. He also points to the fact that there appears to be zero supporting research on conflict with the US.
We have combed the Chinese sources thoroughly, in large numbers of think tankers, analysts, intelligence services, military folks who have looked and looked and looked. If you look at any analysis of the PLA, we're all citing the same sources. It's what we can find. Either they've got the world's largest classified research operation, or they're not doing it. They don't want the military to put too much effort into this idea that China is going to be fighting wars against countries like the United States, because it undermines their message that China is a peace-loving country, that it doesn't intend to get in a war with anybody. It's a very political issue and a very sensitive one for the Chinese.
That doesn't mean Timothy thinks war between the US and China is impossible. He just thinks a direct military conflict is unlikely to work in Beijing's favour, and therefore they just wouldn't opt for it.
Now, one possibility I think that the U.S. and Chinese could end up in a war is if U.S.-China relations degenerate and deteriorate to all-out Cold War-style hostility. And if that's the case, then the U.S. might try and use Taiwan to provoke China, maybe recognize Taiwan independence, who knows. And if that's the case, then you're in a situation where the Chinese could choose to enter hostilities with the U.S. But even if they do that, I'm not convinced that they will fight that kind of war by sending ships across the Pacific to engage the U.S. Navy. And I think it's much more likely that they would favor indirect ways of fighting the U.S. Imagine a China that is actively funding, arming, equipping, and training Russia, North Korea, Iran, Hamas, Hezbollah, all America's enemies all at once.
These are bleak scenarios. And frankly, given how much war there is in the world already, I want to end on an optimistic note. You've heard a lot of different takes on a possible conflict with or over Taiwan during this episode. Timothy Heath, for example, does not think a war is as likely as many other China watchers do.
And I'm not saying that we should do nothing about the Chinese military. They aren't a threat. China's military is worrisome if you look just at their missiles, ships, and aircraft. But in my view, we need to keep perspective. If the likelihood of war is very small, which it is in my view, then the weight of effort we need to put to that problem could be adjusted accordingly, and that could free up military resources to deal with a wide range of other issues for a more balanced approach to national security.
But even for those who do think Xi Jinping is planning to go to war over Taiwan at some point, that still doesn't mean the conflict is inevitable.
The good news is it's actually really easy to deter.
Ariana Schuyler Mastro.
Because while the Chinese are willing to pay some costs for unification with Taiwan, they're not willing to sacrifice everything. So if it looked like the economic costs were going to be severe enough to lead to a 10 to 15% collapse in GDP, then maybe they wouldn't do it. And what that means is that we can deter Xi Jinping from doing this. The United States and allies and partners have to take a number of significant steps we have not done yet, but it is possible. It's not the case that Xi Jinping needs Taiwan to stay in power. It's not the case that he doesn't care about the country. It's just his own glory. None of those are motivators, and so we actually have a chance of preventing the war from happening.
This series was reported and written by me, Venetia Rainey. It was produced by Max Bauer. The executive producer was Louisa Wells, with special thanks to Allegra Mendelsohn. Battle Lines is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Knowles and hosted by me and Roland Oliphant. If you appreciated this show, please consider following Battle Lines on your preferred podcast app. And if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. To stay on top of all of our news, subscribe to The Telegraph, sign up to our Dispatches newsletter, or listen to our sister podcast, Ukraine the Latest. You can get in touch directly by emailing battlelines@telegraph.co.uk or contact us on X. You can find our handles in the show notes.